50 years. That's how long I was married to John. I washed his clothes, cooked his meals, raised our 4 children, and stood by him through everything life threw our way. And in the end, he left me for the man next door. My name is Eleanor, and at 76, I never imagined I'd be starting over. Not after a lifetime spent building what I thought was a solid marriage. But here I am, alone in the house where we raised our family, surrounded by memories that now feel tainted by deception. The whispers started immediately. In our small Connecticut town, news travels faster than a summer storm. "Did you hear about Eleanor and John?" they'd say in hushed tones at church. Poor thing, her husband left her for another man. Some looked at me with pity, others with curiosity, as if searching my face for clues about how I could have missed something so fundamental about the man I shared my life with. I ask myself the same question every morning as I make coffee for one. How did I not know? Were there signs I ignored? The growing distance between us over the years I had chalked up to the natural cooling of a long marriage. The separate bedrooms in our 60s, wasn't that normal at our age? His newfound interest in his appearance, the way he started dyeing his silver hair back to brown, the new clothes. I thought he was just fighting against aging like so many do. What I couldn't explain away was Robert. He moved in next door 3 years ago after his wife passed, a retired accountant with a gentle smile and careful hands that tended to his garden with surprising tenderness. John and Robert became fast friends. Fishing trips, weekly dominoes games, afternoons spent watching baseball. I was happy for John. Men his age need friends, especially after retirement leaves them without the daily social connections of work. I encouraged their friendship, grateful that John had found something that brought a spark back to his eyes. I even invited Robert for dinner every Sunday, served them both my pot roast, and smiled as they discussed politics and sports as if they'd known each other forever. What a fool I was. The day I found out wasn't dramatic. There was no lipstick on his collar, no caught-in-the-act moment like in the movies. Just a text message John had forgotten to delete. I've never felt this way before. You see me for who I really am. And those damned heart emojis that confirmed what I'd been refusing to acknowledge for months. Would you forgive someone who threw away half a century of your life? Someone who looked you in the eyes day after day, year after year, and lived a lie? I'm still trying to answer that question myself. But this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about what happens after your world shatters, when you're left picking up the pieces of your identity at an age when most people are settling comfortably into their final chapter. I met John in the summer of 1965 at a church picnic in our small Connecticut town. I was 21, working as a secretary at the local insurance office, and he was 23, just starting at his father's construction company. I can still remember that day. The checkered tablecloth spread across the picnic table, the smell of fried chicken in the air, and John's shy smile as he asked if he could sit next to me. He was handsome in that clean-cut, all-American way, tall with dark hair and bright blue eyes that crinkled at the corners when he laughed. Our courtship was simple and traditional, like everything else in those days. Sunday drives in his father's Buick, malted milkshakes at Wilson's drugstore, him waiting on my parents' front porch to take me to the movies. We were married a year later at the same church where we met, surrounded by family and friends who all predicted we'd have a wonderful life together. And for many years, we did. John was a good provider, steady and responsible. I gave up my job at the insurance office when we got married. That's what women did back then. Instead, I poured my energy into creating a beautiful home and raising our children. Thomas, Rebecca, Michael, and Catherine. 4 kids in 6 years. Those early days were a blur of diapers and midnight feedings, scraped knees and bedtime stories. I sacrificed everything. My body, my youth, my dreams of maybe becoming something more than just someone's wife. For our family. But I didn't mind. That was the bargain women of my generation made. We were taught that there was no greater calling than being a good wife and mother, and I was good at it. Our home was always clean, meals were on the table on time, the children were well-behaved and properly dressed for church every Sunday. John worked long hours building his father's company into something bigger. He'd come home tired but satisfied, proud of what he was accomplishing. We were building a life together, brick by brick, day by day. Our little Cape Cod house in the suburbs, with the white picket fence and the garden I tended each summer, it was everything we'd been taught to want. There were difficult times, of course. Money was tight when the children were young. John's father died suddenly of a heart attack when we'd been married just 5 years, leaving John to take over the business sooner than expected. I suffered a miscarriage between Michael and Catherine that left me bedridden for weeks, but we weathered these storms together, the way married couples were supposed to. As the children grew, our lives settled into comfortable routines. John at work, me managing the home, family dinners where everyone talked about their day, summer vacations at a rented cottage on Lake Champlain, Christmas mornings with presents piled under the tree, school concerts where I beamed with pride watching our children perform. We were living the American dream, one ordinary day at a time. I never questioned whether John was happy. Men of his generation weren't taught to express their feelings, and I wasn't taught to ask. He provided. He didn't drink too much, or hit me, or the children. He remembered birthdays and anniversaries most of the time. By the standards we were raised with, that was enough. That was success. Looking back now, I wonder when things began to change. Was it when Thomas left for college, the first child to leave the nest? Was it when John turned 40 and bought that ridiculous sports car he barely drove? Was it during those silent dinners when the children were gone and we realized we'd run out of things to say to each other? Or had it always been there, a fault line running through our marriage that I was too busy, too distracted, or too afraid to see? The truth is, I don't know when John stopped loving me, or if he ever truly did. I don't know if he spent our entire marriage longing for something, someone else. I only know that after decades of building a life together, after 4 children and countless shared memories, after surviving all the ordinary trials of marriage and family life, I wasn't enough. I never had been. Maybe that's the cruelest part of betrayal. It doesn't just destroy your present and future, it makes you question your past. Every anniversary celebration, every "I love you," every moment you thought you were building something lasting, was any of it real? Or was it all just a performance, a necessary social script being followed until something better came along? All I know for certain is that in the autumn of 2015, when our youngest grandchild was starting kindergarten, and I was looking forward to growing old with the man I'd loved for half a century, everything I thought I knew about my life was about to change, and it would begin with Robert moving in next door. After our children left home, a silence fell over our marriage. It wasn't sudden. More like a tide slowly receding, leaving behind only the bare sand of what we once had. I noticed it first in the evenings. John would come home from work, hang his coat by the door, and sit in his armchair with the newspaper. We'd exchange the basic courtesies. "How was your day?" "Fine." "Dinner's ready?" "Looks good." But the warmth that had once animated our conversations was gone. For years I told myself this was normal, just the natural evolution of a long marriage. The passion of youth gives way to companionship, doesn't it? That's what my mother had told me, what all the women's magazines said. Marriage changes after the children leave, my friend Marge had confided over coffee. Frank and I barely talk anymore. We'd nodded together, finding comfort in shared experience. But in our case, it was more than just the ordinary cooling of a decades-long relationship. John didn't just become quiet. He became absent, even when he was physically present. He stopped reaching for my hand across the dinner table, stopped asking about my day or telling me about his, stopped kissing me goodnight before we turned out the lights in our separate bedrooms. A gesture we'd started in our 60s when his snoring kept me awake, but one that now felt symbolic of everything else that had drifted apart between us. I tried to bridge the growing distance. I suggested weekend trips to the lake like we used to take, bought tickets to shows I thought he might enjoy, even took a cooking class to learn new recipes that might tempt his increasingly picky appetite. Nothing worked. The man who had once looked at me with such love now gazed right through me, as if I were becoming transparent with age. "It's just retirement," my daughter Rebecca suggested when I hinted at my concerns during one of her visits. "Dad's trying to figure out who he is without work. Give him time." So I gave him time. Months stretched into years. Our 40th anniversary came and went with a perfunctory dinner at the steakhouse in town. Our 45th with barely an acknowledgement. By our 50th, I had stopped expecting anything at all. Looking back, I wonder if I should have confronted him sooner, demanded answers, insisted on counseling. But women of my generation weren't taught to make demands. We were taught to accommodate, to understand, to smooth things over. Keep the peace at all costs. The silent wife was the good wife. And so, I accommodated his increasing detachment. I understood his need for space without questioning why he needed so much of it. I smoothed over the awkward silences at family gatherings when our children noticed the growing distance between us. I kept the peace by slowly erasing more and more of myself, becoming the ghost I felt he already saw when he looked at me. What I didn't know then was that as our life together was fading into a pale imitation of marriage, another relationship was blooming just next door, one that would eventually uproot everything I thought I knew about my husband, my marriage, and myself. I wish I could say I had some premonition, some woman's intuition that warned me. But the truth is, when Robert moved in next door, I welcomed him into our lives with open arms, grateful for anything that might bring a spark of interest back to John's increasingly distant eyes. I never imagined that spark would become a flame that would consume 50 years of marriage, or that I would be left to watch it burn from the sidelines, as invisible in its destruction as I had become in the marriage itself. Robert moved in next door on a crisp September day in 2013. I remember watching from my kitchen window as the moving van pulled up, curious about who would take over the Adams house after they relocated to Florida. He was in his early 70s, a tall man with a slight stoop and a full head of silver hair. A widower, I learned later, who had lost his wife to cancer 2 years before. I baked a blueberry pie to welcome him to the neighborhood, the way people used to do. When I carried it over that evening, John decided to join me, something that surprised me, given how little interest he typically showed in neighborhood matters. "We should make him feel welcome," John said, straightening his collar before we walked over. It was the most enthusiasm I'd seen from him in months. Robert opened the door with a warm smile, inviting us into his half-unpacked living room. He had kind eyes and a soft-spoken manner, apologizing for the boxes everywhere. A retired English professor, he'd moved from Massachusetts to be closer to his daughter and grandchildren in the next town over. "This is very thoughtful of you both," he said, accepting the pie. "I haven't had homemade pie since my Helen passed." We stayed longer than planned that first visit. What I remember most was how animated John became, asking Robert about his teaching career, discussing books they'd both read, debating politics with more energy than I'd seen in years. On our walk home, John actually took my hand, something he hadn't done in so long I'd forgotten the feel of his fingers interlaced with mine. "He seems nice," I said, surprised by this small gesture of connection. "Very interesting man," John replied. "Smart, well-read." Within weeks, Robert and John had established a routine. Sunday afternoons watching football, Wednesday evening dominoes at our kitchen table, weekend fishing trips to the lake where they'd spend hours sitting side by side in comfortable silence. I was happy for John. Men need friends their own age, especially after retirement narrows their social circles. And Robert was unfailingly polite to me, always bringing a small gift when he came over. Flowers from his garden, a book he thought I might enjoy, cookies his daughter had baked. I encouraged the friendship, grateful to see John engaged with something. Someone. The silences in our house didn't feel quite as suffocating with Robert's occasional presence filling the void. For the first time in years, John had stories to tell at dinner. Funny things Robert had said, plans they were making for day trips, political arguments they'd had. It was like watching a plant that had been slowly withering suddenly receive water and sunlight. What I didn't realize was that I was nurturing something that would eventually uproot my entire life. The changes were subtle at first. John started taking more care with his appearance. He bought new clothes without my prompting, traded his worn slippers for proper shoes around the house, even started dyeing his hair again. I was pleased, thinking perhaps our conversations about his friendship with Robert had somehow rekindled his interest in making an effort. Then came the gifts, Small things Robert would give to John: a vintage fishing lure, a rare first edition of Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, a hand-carved walking stick. Nothing inappropriate, nothing that would raise eyebrows, just thoughtful presence between friends, or so I thought. John began spending more and more time next door. "Just going to help Robert install some shelves," he'd say, and disappear for hours. "Robert needs a hand with his garden," was another frequent excuse. The Sunday football games stretched into Sunday dinner, then Sunday evening drinks. The Wednesday dominoes moved from our kitchen to Robert's. Our house grew quieter. The distance between us, which had been slowly widening for years, suddenly seemed to expand into an unbridgeable chasm. On the rare evenings when John was home, he was distracted, checking his phone frequently, smiling at messages that were clearly not from our children or grandchildren. One night, I glanced over as his phone lit up on the coffee table. The notification preview showed a text from Robert. "Miss you already. Can't wait until," followed by a heart emoji. I felt something cold and heavy settle in my stomach, but I said nothing. What was there to say? That I'd seen a text message with a heart? That my husband's best friend missed him? It seemed so flimsy, so easily explained away. And yet, later that week, I noticed John's side of the closet had thinned out. Shirts and pants he wore regularly were missing. His favorite sweater, the blue one our daughter Rebecca had given him for Christmas, was gone. When I asked, he mumbled something about donating old clothes, but I knew those items weren't old. They were migrating, piece by piece, to Robert's house. John started sleeping on the couch more nights than not. "My back," he'd explain. "The couch helps." But sometimes the couch was empty in the morning, the blanket neatly folded. He'd appear at breakfast with damp hair and fresh clothes, claiming he'd gotten up early to walk around the neighborhood. In February, in New England. I tried talking to my friend Marge about my suspicions, but she brushed them off. "Eleanor, they're just friends. Men can have close friendships too, you know. You're probably just jealous that John has found something that makes him happy." But I knew. In my heart, I knew. And the day I walked past Robert's house and saw two silhouettes moving behind the curtains, slow dancing to music I could faintly hear through the open window, the last of my doubts evaporated. My husband of 50 years was in love with the man next door. Life began to change when Robert moved in next door, but not in the way I expected. At first, I was genuinely happy that John had found a friend. After decades of increasing isolation, seeing him animated again felt like a small miracle. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, other changes began to appear. John started caring about his appearance again. The man who had worn the same 3 sweaters in rotation for years suddenly wanted new clothes. He bought crisp button-down shirts, sweaters in colors I'd never seen him wear, slacks that actually fit instead of hanging loosely from his thinning frame. He started using a different aftershave, something woodsy and expensive that I didn't recognize. "You look nice," I said one evening, as he prepared to go next door for their weekly dominoes game. "Special occasion?" "Just felt like making an effort," he replied, avoiding my eyes in the mirror as he combed his newly dyed hair. The bathroom counter, once Spartan with just a razor and a bar of soap, now held moisturizer, cologne, and hair products. When I mentioned it casually to my daughter Rebecca during one of her rare visits, she smiled. "Dad's finally taking care of himself. Isn't that what you always wanted?" But it wasn't just his appearance. It was the gifts. Small things at first. A vintage fishing lure Robert had found at an antique store. A book John had mentioned wanting to read. Then more personal items. A cashmere scarf for Christmas. An expensive watch for his birthday. "Don't you think that's a bit much?" I asked when John unwrapped the watch. A sleek silver timepiece that must have cost hundreds. "Robert's generous," John said with a shrug. "And he has the money to spend. His wife left him well off." The time John spent next door increased steadily. What started as occasional dominoes games became daily visits. Sunday afternoons stretched into evenings, then overnight fishing trips. When he was home, he was distracted, checking his phone constantly, smiling at messages in a way I hadn't seen in years. One evening, I glanced at his phone when it lit up on the coffee table. The message preview showed a text from Robert. "Miss you already. Can't wait for tomorrow." A heart emoji. From a 70-year-old retired English professor to my husband of 50 years. I said nothing. What could I say that wouldn't sound paranoid or jealous? They were friends. Men could be friends. Men could be affectionate with friends. Times had changed since we were young. But the knot in my stomach tightened. John began sleeping on the couch more nights than not. My back, he'd explain when I questioned him. The firm surface helps, but sometimes the couch was empty in the morning, the blanket neatly folded as if he'd never been there. He'd appear at breakfast, freshly showered, claiming he'd gotten up early to walk around the neighborhood. In February, in New England, with temperatures in the 20s. His clothes began migrating next door. First just a jacket left behind, then a change of clothes, in case we get caught in the rain while fishing. Soon, his side of our closet looked sparse, key pieces missing, his favorite blue sweater from Rebecca, the dress shirts he wore to church, the good slacks he'd bought for our granddaughter's graduation. "Did you donate some clothes?" I asked one day, staring at the empty hangers. "Just getting rid of things I don't wear anymore," he said, not meeting my eyes. One afternoon I was walking home from the grocery store when I passed Robert's house. The curtains were partially open, and though I didn't mean to look inside, movement caught my eye. Two figures were slow dancing in Robert's living room, silhouetted against the warm light, bodies pressed close together. The taller figure was unmistakably John. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, grocery bags cutting into my fingers as 50 years of marriage crystallized into a single, devastating moment of clarity. All the signs I'd been ignoring, all the explanations I'd been making to myself, they collapsed under the weight of what I was seeing. My husband was in love with someone else, with Robert. I continued home mechanically, put away the groceries, and sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing. When John came home that evening, I said nothing about what I'd seen. I wasn't ready. Not yet. The next day, I tried talking to my friend Marge about my suspicions. "Eleanor, they're just friends," she said dismissively over coffee at her kitchen table. "Men can have close friendships too, you know. You're probably just jealous that John has found something that makes him happy." But I knew what I'd seen. The way they moved together, the intimacy of their bodies, that wasn't just friendship. The evidence continued to mount. John's wedding ring disappeared from the bathroom counter where he'd always left it at night. "The band was getting tight," he explained when I asked. "My fingers are swelling with age." One night, I heard him on the phone in the backyard, speaking in low, intimate tones I hadn't heard from him in decades. "I can't keep living like this," he whispered. "It's not fair to any of us." When he came inside, his eyes were red-rimmed. He looked simultaneously devastated and relieved, like someone who had finally made a difficult decision. I knew then that our marriage was over. I just didn't know how to face it, how to put it into words, how to make it real by speaking it aloud. So I waited, watching my husband drift further away from me, one day at a time, until he was ready to tell me himself. The signs had been there all along. I just hadn't wanted to see them. I knew in my heart something was happening long before I could prove it. It's that feeling you get when something shifts in your world. Subtle at first, like shadows lengthening before sunset. You can't quite put your finger on it, but it's there, nagging at the corners of your mind. On most days, I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. After all, what would a handsome retired professor like Robert want with my John? They were just friends. Two older men enjoying each other's company in the golden years of life. Wasn't that what we all wanted for our spouses? Companionship beyond the walls of our marriages? But there were moments when doubt would creep in, cold and insistent. Like when I'd walk past Robert's house on my way back from the grocery store and hear their laughter through the open windows. A different kind of laughter than I'd heard from John in years. Intimate, unguarded. The way people laugh when they're truly themselves. One Tuesday afternoon in March, I was pruning my rose bushes when I saw John emerge from Robert's house. He didn't see me, hidden as I was behind the overgrown hydrangeas. He paused on Robert's porch, looked around quickly, furtively, and then leaned back through the doorway. What I saw next made my heart stop. John kissed Robert goodbye, not the casual cheek peck of friends or the brief hug of buddies parting ways. This was a kiss between lovers, lingering and tender in a way that John hadn't kissed me in decades. I dropped my pruning shears. They made a soft thud in the mulch, but neither man noticed. After John walked away, whistling, I remained frozen behind the hydrangeas, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The evidence I had been both dreading and secretly waiting for had appeared, plain as day, in the weak spring sunshine. For a week after that, I said nothing. I watched as John continued his charade, coming home for dinner, making small talk about his day, sleeping on the couch with the excuse that his back was bothering him. I noticed how he checked his phone constantly, smiling at messages, how he would disappear for hours to help Robert with his garden, even though Robert's yard showed little evidence of any serious gardening. The confirmation came when I was doing laundry one afternoon. John had always been careless about emptying his pockets, and I'd found everything from loose change to crumpled receipts over the years. But that day, what I found was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. "My dearest Jay," it began, "last night was wonderful. Each moment with you feels like coming home to the person I was always meant to be." It was signed simply R, with a carefully drawn heart. I sat on the edge of the bed, that damning piece of paper trembling in my hands. This wasn't just friendship. This wasn't just a phase or a midlife crisis or whatever other excuses I'd been making in my head. This was love. My husband of 50 years was in love with someone else. When I confronted my friend Marge about my suspicions, she brushed them off with the practiced ease of someone who'd never had her foundations shaken. "Eleanor, they're just friends," she said over coffee at her kitchen table. "Men can have close friendships too, you know. You're probably just jealous that John has found something that makes him happy." I wanted to show her the note, to make her understand that this wasn't jealousy. It was the painful recognition of truth, but I couldn't bring myself to share something so private, so devastating. Instead, I nodded and changed the subject, carrying the weight of my knowledge alone. The final piece of certainty came on a rainy evening in April. John had told me he was going fishing with Robert, despite the forecast. I'd raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Around 9 o'clock, I decided to drive by the lake where they supposedly were, more out of a need to confirm what I already knew than any real doubt. Their cars weren't at the lake. On a hunch, I drove past Robert's house. Both cars were parked in the driveway. Through the partially open curtains, I could see them slow dancing in Robert's living room, John's head resting on Robert's shoulder, swaying to music I couldn't hear through the rain tapping on my car windows. I didn't feel anger in that moment, just a profound, bone-deep sadness, not just for the betrayal, but for the years, decades of pretending. Had John ever loved me the way he clearly loved Robert? Had our entire marriage been a performance, a concession to the expectations of a different era? When I got home, I sat in the dark living room for hours, surrounded by the remnants of our life together, the wedding photos, the family portraits, the souvenirs from trips we'd taken. Everything suddenly felt like props in an elaborate play that had finally, mercifully, reached its final act. The next morning, John came home early, his clothes damp from the fishing trip. He seemed startled to find me sitting at the kitchen table, fully dressed, hands folded in front of me. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. His face went pale. He knew that I knew. And in that moment, as our eyes met across the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals over 50 years, I saw something else in his expression. Relief. I'd prepared myself for this moment. Hours spent staring at the ceiling in the middle of the night had hardened something inside me. When I finally sat John down at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of meals over half a century, my hands were steady. It was time. "John," I said, keeping my voice even, "we need to talk about what's happening with you and Robert." His face went pale. Not with shock, but with the unmistakable pallor of someone caught in a lie they'd been telling for too long. He glanced toward the door as if plotting an escape route, then back at me, his eyes not quite meeting mine. "What do you mean?" he asked, but the question lacked conviction. We both knew exactly what I meant. "I saw you," I said simply, "last week, at Robert's house, dancing together in his living room." John's shoulders slumped. For a moment, he looked older than his 75 years, the weight of deception finally catching up to him. Part of me wanted to reach across the table and take his hand, to tell him it was going to be all right. But it wasn't going to be all right. Nothing would ever be the same again. "How long have you known?" he finally asked. "Long enough," I replied. "The late nights, the missing clothes, the way you look at him when you think no one is watching, the heart emojis in your texts. I'm not blind, John, and I'm not stupid." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on his hands folded in front of him. The wedding band that had been there for 50 years was conspicuously absent. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said after a long silence. "I never planned to fall in love with him," I finished for him, "or to lie to me for months." "Which part wasn't planned, John?" His head snapped up, his eyes finally meeting mine. "None of it was planned, Eleanor. Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I wanted to hurt you?" "I don't know what you wanted," I said, my voice finally cracking. "That's the problem. After 50 years of marriage, I thought I knew you, but now I realize I never did." John reached across the table then, trying to take my hand, but I pulled away. I couldn't bear his touch, not now, not when I knew those same hands had been touching someone else, caressing someone else, loving someone else. "Eleanor, please," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I do love you. I always have. Just not the way you love him," I said. It wasn't a question. He closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his weathered cheek. "It's different," he whispered. "With him, I feel seen. I can be myself." The words hit me like a physical blow. 50 years together, and he had never felt seen by me? Never felt he could be himself? What did that say about our entire marriage, about the life we'd built together? "And who is that?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "This self you can be with him, but not with me?" John looked at me with a mixture of guilt and what I can only describe as relief. The relief of someone who has carried a heavy secret for too long. I've always been attracted to men," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "But in our day, our time, that wasn't an option. It wasn't something you could admit, even to yourself. So I did what everyone expected. I married a wonderful woman, had children, built a life. And I was happy, Eleanor. Our life together wasn't a lie." "Wasn't it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "No," he insisted. "I loved you. I still love you. Just not in the way I should have. Not in the way you deserved." The kitchen fell silent. Outside, I could hear the neighbor's lawnmower, the distant shouts of children playing, the normal sounds of a world continuing to turn while mine was shattering into pieces. "I want a divorce," John said finally, the words hanging in the air between us. I had expected this, had been preparing myself for weeks, but hearing him say it out loud still felt like having the air knocked out of my lungs. 50 years of marriage ended with 5 simple words. "I'm moving in with Robert," he continued when I didn't respond. "I've already packed most of my things. I didn't want to do this to you, Eleanor. But I can't keep living a lie. Not at my age. Not with whatever time I have left." I thought of all the signs I'd missed or ignored over the decades. The emotional distance that I'd attributed to his personality or to the natural cooling of a long marriage. The separate bedrooms in our later years that seemed so practical, so normal for a couple our age. Had there been other men before Robert? Other moments when John had yearned for something, someone else? Or had he truly spent half a century suppressing a fundamental part of himself? Were there others? I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. John shook his head. "No, not until Robert. I never acted on it, never allowed myself to even think about it too much. But when he moved in next door," he trailed off, his expression softening in a way that sent a fresh wave of pain through my heart. "When he moved in next door, everything changed," I finished for him. John nodded. "I'm sorry," he said, and I believed him. "I never wanted to hurt you. You've been the best wife any man could ask for. This isn't your fault. None of it is. But it felt like my fault. If I had been more attentive, more passionate, more something, maybe John wouldn't have fallen for Robert. Maybe we would still be the couple that everyone in town pointed to as an example of a successful marriage. The high school sweethearts who had beaten the odds and stayed together through thick and thin. What about the children? I asked, thinking of the awkward explanations, the shocked reactions, the painful conversations that lay ahead. "I'll talk to them," John said. I owe them that much. They'll be devastated, I said. Confused. They might not understand. I know, he admitted. But they're adults with families of their own. They'll come to terms with it eventually. And I hope they'll still want me in their lives. I wasn't so sure. Our children had been raised in the same conservative, traditional environment we had. The idea of their father leaving their mother for another man after 50 years of marriage would be more than shocking. It would be incomprehensible. And what about me? I asked, the question that had been burning inside me since I first realized what was happening. What am I supposed to do now? At 76? Start over? Date? Sit alone in this house with nothing but memories that now feel tainted? John had no answer for that. He just looked at me with sad eyes, and I realized that in his mind he had already moved on. He was already living his new life with Robert, while I was left behind to pick up the pieces of the old one. I'm sorry, he said again, standing up from the table. I'll come by tomorrow to get the rest of my things. And just like that, 50 years of marriage ended at our kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon. No dramatic showdown, no plates thrown against walls, no screaming matches, just the quiet devastation of a final conversation and the soft click of the front door as John walked out of our home and my life for the last time. The news spread through our small town like wildfire. John had left his wife of 50 years for Robert, the charming widower next door. I became the subject of whispered conversations at the grocery store, sidelong glances at church, and awkward silences when I entered a room. The story grew more sensational with each retelling, as if people needed to add drama to what was already the most devastating moment of my life. Did you hear about Eleanor? Poor thing, her husband left her for another man. After all those years, can you imagine? The shame of it. I always thought there was something odd about John. Our children's reactions were even more painful. Thomas, our oldest, refused to speak to his father for months. He'd call me almost daily, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Mom, I can't believe he did this to you. To us, it's disgusting. Rebecca was devastated, but tried to maintain relationships with both of us. I don't understand it, Mom, she said during one of her visits, her eyes red from crying. But he's still my dad. I don't know how to just cut him out of my life. Michael, always the peacemaker, tried to find some middle ground. People change, Mom. Maybe Dad was always this way and just couldn't admit it. At least he's being honest now. His attempts at rationalization felt like another betrayal. Catherine, our youngest, was perhaps the most deeply affected. Everything I thought I knew about my childhood was a lie, she sobbed over the phone. How am I supposed to trust my own memories now? I tried to comfort them all, to be the strong mother I'd always been. But how could I ease their pain when I could barely manage my own? The most difficult part was how quickly I seemed to become invisible in our community. People who had known me for decades suddenly didn't know what to say to me. Friends I'd had for years found excuses not to meet for our regular coffee dates. Even at church, where I'd taught Sunday school and organized countless bake sales, I found myself sitting alone, a pariah by association. Worse still was the strange sense that I was somehow at fault. What did you miss? People would ask, not quite meeting my eyes. Were there signs? As if I had failed as a wife by not detecting my husband's hidden sexual orientation over half a century of marriage. John and Robert, meanwhile, seemed to face far less social condemnation than I expected. There were murmurs, of course, and some of our older friends stopped speaking to John entirely. But many people in town expressed a kind of progressive approval, as if John's late-in-life coming out was brave and admirable rather than a devastating betrayal of the promises he'd made to me. It must have been so hard for him, living a lie all these years. I overheard Marge telling someone at the pharmacy. This from the same woman who had dismissed my suspicions just weeks earlier. At their age, they should be able to find happiness, said another. No one seemed to consider what it meant for me. To be discarded after 50 years, to have my entire life reframed as a sham, to be left alone in my 70s when we should have been enjoying our golden years together. The house felt cavernous without John. Every room held memories that now felt tainted. The kitchen where we'd shared thousands of meals. The living room where we'd watched our children open Christmas presents. The garden we'd tended together each spring. Even our bedroom, though he'd stopped sleeping there years ago, seemed to mock me with its half-empty closet and the lingering scent of his aftershave. I spent the first few weeks after he left barely functioning. I'd wake up, make coffee, and then sit at the kitchen table staring at nothing until the coffee grew cold. Sometimes I'd forget to eat until dizziness reminded me. I stopped answering the phone, stopped checking the mail, stopped caring about the dust collecting on surfaces or the wilting plants in the window boxes. What was the point? After 50 years of being someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's pillar, I had no idea who Eleanor was on her own. The lowest point came about a month after John left. I was grocery shopping, my first real outing in weeks, when I turned a corner and saw them. John and Robert, heads bent close together over a display of apples, laughing about something. They looked happy, comfortable, like they belonged together. I abandoned my cart in the middle of the aisle and fled to my car, where I sat sobbing until I could barely breathe. Not just from the pain of seeing them together, but from the realization that in 50 years of marriage, I had rarely seen John look that relaxed, that content, that genuinely himself. Had he ever been happy with me? Had any of it been real? Or had I spent my entire adult life as an unwitting supporting character in someone else's story? That night, I did something I hadn't done since I was a young woman. I got thoroughly, completely drunk. Alone in my house, I opened a bottle of red wine that had been saving for a special occasion, and I drank glass after glass, toasting the wreckage of my life. To 50 years of lies, I said to the empty chair across from me. To a marriage that never was. By the third glass, I was crying again. By the fourth, I was ransacking drawers and closets, pulling out photo albums and mementos, determined to find some evidence that our life together had meant something. By the fifth, I was sitting on the bedroom floor, surrounded by the debris of our marriage, too drunk and exhausted to feel anything but numb. I woke the next morning with a splitting headache and a mess to clean up, both literally and figuratively. As I gathered the scattered photos and keepsakes, something shifted inside me. This couldn't be how my story ended. I refused to be reduced to the sad old woman abandoned by her husband. I had spent too many years being strong for everyone else to crumble now, when I needed that strength for myself. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Marlene, an old friend from my secretarial days who had moved away decades ago. She was passing through town and wanted to meet for lunch. I heard about John, she said when we sat down at the local diner. Men are trash, Eleanor, always have been. I laughed for the first time in weeks. Marlene had been divorced 3 times and wore her cynicism like a badge of honor. Come on, she said, squeezing my hand across the table. The senior center has a water aerobics class starting next week. You're coming with me. I can't, I protested. I haven't been in a swimsuit in 20 years. All the more reason, she insisted. Eleanor, you've spent 50 years being John's wife. Now it's time to figure out who Eleanor is. I wanted to refuse, to go back to my empty house and my grief. But something in Marlene's determined expression wouldn't let me retreat. Fine, I conceded. 1 class, but I'm not promising to enjoy it. I had no idea then that this reluctant agreement would be the first step toward rebuilding my life from the ruins John had left behind. That in losing the identity I'd held for half a century, I would finally discover the woman I was meant to be all along. For weeks after John left, I moved through our house like a ghost, a wisp of who I once was, floating from room to room without purpose or destination. Some days, I'd find myself standing in the kitchen, staring at the coffee maker, with no memory of how I got there or how long I'd been standing. Other times, I'd look up from a book to realize hours had passed and I hadn't turned a single page. The house I'd lovingly tended for 50 years now felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. Every corner held memories that cut like glass. The doorframe with pencil marks tracking our children's growth. The dining table where we'd shared thousands of meals. The garden bench where John had proposed half a century ago. I couldn't bear to look at them, yet I couldn't look away. Sleep became my only escape. I'd go to bed earlier each night and rise later each morning, the hours in between filled with fitful dreams where John was still beside me, where our marriage hadn't been built on sand. but waking was always the same cruel reminder. I was alone at 76, abandoned for someone else. You should get rid of his things, Rebecca suggested during one of her visits, her eyes moving from the coat rack where John's jacket still hung to the closet where his shirts remained. It might help you move on, but I couldn't bring myself to erase him. Not yet. Removing his belongings would make his absence real in a way I wasn't ready to face. My lowest point came about 6 weeks after he left. I was at the grocery store, mechanically placing items in my cart. Smaller portions now, single servings of everything. When I turned a corner, and there they were. John and Robert, heads bent close together over the produce display, John laughing at something Robert had said. They hadn't seen me yet, and for a moment I simply stood frozen, cart clutched in white-knuckled hands, watching them. They looked happy, comfortable, natural together in a way that made my stomach twist with both pain and a strange sort of clarity. In 50 years, I had rarely seen John's face so unguarded, so at ease. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a late-life crisis or a temporary infatuation. This was real. I abandoned my cart in the middle of the aisle and fled, tears blurring my vision as I drove home. That night, I did something I hadn't done since college. I got thoroughly, completely drunk. Alone in my kitchen, I opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving for our anniversary and drank glass after glass, toasting the wreckage of my life. To 50 years of lies, I said to the empty chair across from me. To a marriage that never was. By the time I reached the bottom of the bottle, I was ransacking drawers and closets, pulling out photo albums and mementos, searching for, what? Evidence that our life together had been real? Proof that John had loved me at some point? I fell asleep on the living room floor, surrounded by the debris of a half-century of shared history that now felt like an elaborate fiction. I woke the next morning with a splitting headache and a mess to clean up, both literally and figuratively. As I gathered scattered photos and keepsakes, something shifted inside me. A quiet voice beneath the pain whispered, "This cannot be how your story ends." That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Marlene, an old friend from my secretarial days whom I hadn't spoken to in years. She was passing through town and wanted to meet for lunch. "I heard about John," she said bluntly when we sat down at the local diner. Her directness was both jarring and refreshing after weeks of sympathetic murmurs and averted eyes from neighbors and friends. "Men are trash, Eleanor. Always have been." I laughed for the first time in weeks, a rusty sound that surprised me. Marlene had been divorced 3 times and wore her cynicism like a badge of honor. "What are you doing with yourself these days?" she asked, studying me over her coffee cup. "Nothing," I admitted. "Just existing." She frowned. "That won't do. The senior center has a water aerobics class starting next week. You're coming with me." "I can't," I protested automatically. "I haven't been in a swimsuit in 20 years. "All the more reason," she insisted, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "Eleanor, you've spent 50 years being John's wife. Now it's time to figure out who Eleanor is." I wanted to refuse, to retreat back to my empty house and my grief. But something in Marlene's determined expression wouldn't let me. "Fine," I conceded. "1 class, but I'm not promising to enjoy it." The following Tuesday, I found myself standing awkwardly at the edge of the community center pool, wearing a modest black swimsuit and feeling painfully exposed. Around me, women of various ages and shapes chatted easily, seemingly unconcerned about their bodies or who might be judging them. "I can't do this," I whispered to Marlene, panic rising. "Everyone will stare." "Honey, at our age nobody's looking," she replied with a laugh. "And if they are, who cares? We've earned every wrinkle and sag." The instructor, a cheerful woman in her 60s named Gloria, blew her whistle and called us into the water. To my surprise, the cool water embraced me like an old friend. As we began the gentle movements, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a moment of peace. For an hour, I wasn't John's abandoned wife or the neighborhood object of pity. I was just a woman moving her body through water, feeling muscles awaken and stretch. After class, several women invited Marlene and me to join them for coffee. I hesitated, but Marlene answered for me. "We'd love to." Sitting in the small cafe adjacent to the community center, I found myself surrounded by women my age, all with stories of their own. Sarah had lost her husband to cancer 2 years ago. Patricia had divorced her philandering spouse after 40 years. Helen was caring for her husband with Alzheimer's. They shared their experiences without self-pity, exchanging practical advice and occasional bawdy jokes that made me blush and then laugh. "The first year is the hardest," Sarah told me, her eyes kind. "But it does get better. You find ways to fill the spaces they left behind. And sometimes," Patricia added with a wink, "you find that what fills those spaces is far better than what was there before." As I drove home that afternoon, I felt something subtle shift inside me. The pain was still there, the betrayal still raw, but alongside it was something new. A tiny flicker of possibility. Perhaps there was life after John. Perhaps being abandoned at 76 wasn't the end of my story, but the beginning of a new chapter I hadn't anticipated. The next day, I signed up for the full water aerobics session. The day after that, I called a real estate agent to discuss selling our house, my house now. The memories it held were too heavy, too painful. I needed a fresh start in a place that wasn't haunted by 50 years of what I now questioned had ever been real. Slowly, tentatively, I began to rediscover who Eleanor was beneath the layers of wife, mother, grandmother, roles that had defined me for so long. I joined a book club at the library. I volunteered at the elementary school, reading to children once a week. I even took a painting class, something I'd always wanted to try but had never found the time for when managing a household was my primary occupation. None of it came easily. There were still days when grief ambushed me, when I'd find myself reaching for the phone to tell John something before remembering he wasn't mine to call anymore. Nights when I'd wake up reaching for a warm body that wasn't there. Moments when I'd see elderly couples holding hands in the park and feel a surge of bitter envy so strong it took my breath away. But there were also new joys I hadn't anticipated. The freedom to eat what I wanted, when I wanted. The pleasure of decorating my new, smaller apartment exactly to my taste, without compromising. The satisfaction of making decisions, large and small, without consulting anyone else. The delight of female friendships that deepened as we shared vulnerabilities and strengths. 6 months after John left, I ran into him and Robert at a restaurant in the next town over. My heart stuttered at the sight of them, so comfortable together, so obviously a couple. John looked startled, then guilty when he saw me. He excused himself from Robert and approached my table. "Eleanor," he said, his voice uncertain, "you look different." Good. I studied him. This man I'd shared a life with, now practically a stranger. "I am different," I replied simply. He nodded, shifting uncomfortably. "I'm glad. I've worried about you." Something inside me bristled at that. After abandoning me, after shattering the life we'd built, he had the audacity to say he'd worried about me. "You don't need to worry," I said, my voice steady. "I'm doing just fine without you." And in that moment, I realized it was true. I was doing fine. Not perfect, not healed, but finding my way forward one day at a time. As John returned to Robert, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The man I had loved, had built a life with, had borne children with, was happy with someone else. And while that knowledge still held pain, it no longer felt like it would destroy me. I was building something new from the ruins he'd left behind, something that was entirely mine. Looking back at my life after John left, I entered what I now call my awakening phase. It wasn't a sudden transformation, more like a slow, steady unfurling of a self I had kept tucked away for decades. A self that existed before I became someone's wife and mother. A self I had almost forgotten. The first 6 months were the hardest. There were days when grief would ambush me without warning. At the grocery store, when I'd automatically reach for John's favorite cereal. Or when a song from our courting days played on the radio. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night, disoriented by the emptiness beside me, even though John hadn't slept there for years. Grief, I discovered, doesn't follow a straight line. It loops back on itself, catching you unaware just when you think you've moved past it. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, those moments became less frequent. The senior swim class Marlene had dragged me to became the highlight of my week, I found myself looking forward to the gentle movement in the water, the weightlessness, the company of other women who carried their own stories of loss and renewal. "You're smiling more," Gloria, our instructor, commented one day as we toweled off after class. "It suits you." I touched my face, surprised. I hadn't noticed. My small apartment began to feel like home. Without John's preferences to consider, I painted the walls a soft sage green that I'd always loved, but he had dismissed as too feminine. I hung artwork that spoke to me, watercolors of gardens and seascapes, rather than the hunting prints John had insisted on. I planted window boxes with bright geraniums and lavender. Small choices, but each one a declaration. This is who I am now. The most unexpected joy came from rediscovering old friendships and forming new ones. The water aerobics group expanded to weekly coffee meetings, then occasional dinners out, then day trips to nearby towns. These women, Sarah, Patricia, Helen, Marlene, and others who joined our circle, became my lifeline. We shared stories, advice, laughter, and sometimes tears. We compared notes on adjusting to life alone after decades of partnership. We celebrated small victories and supported each other through setbacks. "Men think they're doing us a favor by leaving," Patricia remarked over wine one evening. "They never consider that they might be setting us free." The thought had never occurred to me before. Had John's departure, painful as it was, actually liberated me in some way? Had our marriage been confining us both in roles that no longer fit? I began to look back at our 50 years together with new eyes. The good memories remained, the birth of our children, family vacations, quiet moments of connection. But I also acknowledged the compromises I'd made, the dreams I'd deferred, the parts of myself I'd suppressed to maintain our life together. I wondered if John had done the same. 8 months after he left, I ran into John and Robert at a restaurant in the next town over. My heart still stuttered at the sight of them, but the pain wasn't as sharp as before. John excused himself from Robert and approached my table. "Eleanor," he said, his voice uncertain, "you look different." Good. I studied him. This man I'd shared my life with, now practically a stranger. "I am different," I replied simply. He nodded, shifting uncomfortably. "I've worried about you." Something inside me bristled at that. After abandoning me, after shattering the life we'd built, he had the audacity to say he'd worried about me? "You don't need to worry," I said, my voice steady. "I'm doing just fine without you." As he returned to Robert, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. I had spoken my truth without anger or bitterness. I had stood in my own power. It was a small moment, but a significant one. In the months that followed, I continued to rebuild my life piece by piece. I took a part-time job at the local library, shelving books and helping with children's story hour. I joined a book club that challenged me to read outside my comfort zone. I even signed up for a painting class, fulfilling a creative urge I'd suppressed for decades. "You've reinvented yourself," my daughter Rebecca said during one of her visits, looking around my apartment with new respect in her eyes. "I don't think I've ever seen you so alive." I considered her words. "Not reinvented," I corrected gently. "Rediscovered. This is who I was all along, underneath everything else." The greatest challenge came at family gatherings, where John and Robert were now invited as a couple. Our children had eventually adjusted to their father's new reality, though Thomas still maintained a cool distance. At Thanksgiving at Rebecca's house, I watched as John and Robert arrived together, bearing wine and dessert, greeted with hugs by our grandchildren. A year earlier, the sight would have devastated me. Now I felt a complex mixture of emotions, a whisper of pain, yes, but also acceptance. This was our new normal. We were still a family, just reconfigured into a different shape. Later that evening, I found myself alone on the porch swing with John, a moment of awkward proximity neither of us had planned. "Are you happy, Eleanor?" he asked suddenly, his eyes searching my face in the dim porch light. I thought about the question, about all that had happened since that devastating conversation at our kitchen table, about the pain and loss, but also about the unexpected gifts that had emerged from the wreckage: freedom, self-discovery, new connections, courage I hadn't known I possessed. I'm getting there, I answered truthfully. And you? He nodded slowly. Yes, I am. With Robert, I can be. He paused, searching for words. I can be all of myself. I understand that now, I said, surprising both of us. Not at first, but I do now. We sat in silence for a moment, the porch swing creaking gently beneath us. I'm sorry, he said finally. Not for being with Robert, but for how I handled everything. For not being honest sooner, for the years of distance. I'm sorry too, I replied. For not seeing you, really seeing you, for who you were. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, the wound was still too fresh for that, but it was a step towards something like peace. An acknowledgement that we had both been trapped in a marriage that couldn't accommodate our true selves for different reasons. As I approach my 77th birthday, I look back on the past year with a sense of wonder. Never would I have imagined, as I sat devastated at my kitchen table the day John told me he was leaving, that I would find my way to this new life. That I would discover strength I didn't know I possessed. That I would learn to be alone without being lonely. That I would find joy again. Do I forgive John? That's a complicated question. I understand him better now. I can see how the constraints of our generation, the expectations, the limitations, the silence around certain truths, shaped both our lives in ways neither of us fully recognized until it was too late. I can acknowledge that his decision to leave, painful as it was for me, came from a place of authenticity rather than cruelty. But forgiveness? Perhaps that's still evolving, like everything else in this new chapter of my life. What I do know is this: being left by my husband of 50 years for another man was not the end of my story. In many ways, it was the beginning of a new one in which I am finally the author of my own life. So would I have forgiven him? Or would I have done what I did? Start over? Rediscover myself? Build something new from the ruins he left behind? I think you know the answer. Since the day John left, I've undergone a profound transformation. One that surprised me as much as it might surprise you. What began as the most painful chapter of my life slowly became something unexpected, a journey of rediscovery. 1 year after our separation, I found myself sitting across from John at our granddaughter's college graduation. We managed to be civil, even warm at times. The children had adjusted to our new reality, though Thomas still maintained a certain distance from his father. They had all come to terms with John and Robert's relationship in their own ways and at their own pace. "You look good, Eleanor," John said during a quiet moment at the reception. "There's something different about you." I smiled, knowing he was right. I was different. The devastation of his betrayal had forced me to rebuild myself from the ground up. In doing so, I discovered parts of myself that had been dormant for decades. My small apartment had become a sanctuary, decorated entirely to my taste. I'd joined a book club at the library, where I'd made new friends and rediscovered my love of reading. The water aerobics class had become a fixture in my week, followed by coffee with the ladies, Sarah, Patricia, Helen, and Marlene. We called ourselves the Second Act Club, all women rebuilding their lives after loss, betrayal, or major change. I'd even started dating, something I never thought I'd do at 77. Nothing serious, just occasional dinners with Harold, a kind widower I'd met at a community center dance. We enjoyed each other's company without expectations or pressure. It felt strange and wonderful to be appreciated simply for who I was, not for what I could provide or who I had been for half a century. "I am different," I told John. I had to be. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry for how I handled everything, not for being with Robert. I won't apologize for finally being honest about who I am, but for the way I hurt you. You deserved better." "Yes," I agreed, surprising us both with my directness. I did. We shared a small smile then, acknowledging what we both knew. Our marriage had been built on shifting sand, part genuine love, part societal expectation, part mutual compromise. Neither of us had been fully seen or fully known by the other. And while that didn't excuse his betrayal, it helped explain it. When Robert joined us, there was an awkward moment, but then he extended his hand to me. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" I asked. For not hating us. For allowing your family to still include John. I know how easy it would have been to turn them against him. I looked at this man who had upended my life, who had given John something I never could, and I realized I no longer hated him either. He hadn't set out to destroy my marriage. He had simply found in John what John had been searching for his entire life, the freedom to be himself completely. Hate takes too much energy, I said finally, and I've found better uses for mine these days. Later that evening, back in my apartment, I sat on my balcony watching the sunset. I thought about the strange journey I'd been on since that day in the kitchen when John told me he was leaving. The pain, the shame, the grief, the anger, all of it had been real and necessary. But so was the growth, the discovery, the newfound independence. I thought about forgiveness. Had I forgiven John? Perhaps not entirely. The wound was still tender in places, but I had stopped letting it define me. I had stopped allowing his choices to determine my worth or my future. I had, in the end, chosen myself, perhaps for the first time in my adult life. I had chosen to rebuild rather than wither, to explore rather than retreat, to live fully rather than merely exist in the shadow of betrayal. So would I have forgiven him? Or would I have done what I did, start over and rediscover myself? I think the answer lies in understanding that sometimes the greatest act of self-love isn't forgiveness, but rather the courage to walk away and create something new. Sometimes the most profound healing comes not from patching what was broken, but from building something different entirely. Life after betrayal isn't about getting even or getting back what was lost. It's about getting on, moving forward into whatever time remains with openness, curiosity, and the hard-earned wisdom that comes from surviving what you once thought would destroy you. At 77, I never expected to be starting over, but here I am, the author of my own life at last, and while I wouldn't wish my path on anyone else, I can't regret where it has led me. To this moment, this peace, this unexpected second chance at truly living. So if you find yourself standing in the ruins of what you thought would last forever, know this: it isn't the end. It might just be the beginning of the most authentic chapter of your life. And one day, you might look back and realize that what seemed like the worst thing that could happen to you actually set you free.